Wealthy diplomat discovers homeless alien girl teaching his son, the shocking twist that follows. The city of Orbital City gleamed under the soft glow of the twin moons that hung high in the dark sky. The city was a bustling metropolis, where towering skyscrapers made of gleaming metal and crystal rose up, reaching for the stars. In the heart of this shining city stood the grand diplomatic complex, a place where Earth's ambassador, Alexander Carter, spent most of his time. He was the face of Earth's diplomatic relations with countless alien species, a role that was equal parts exhausting and demanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden hue across the city, Alexander adjusted the crimson tie that hung loosely around his neck. He had just finished a long day of meetings. Alien diplomats, with their strange customs and languages, filled the room, each one trying to outmaneuver the other with their subtle threats and veiled promises. The tension was palpable, the air thick with hidden agendas. By the time the meetings ended, Alexander was mentally drained. All he wanted now was to get back to the penthouse, pour himself a glass of Terran whiskey, and forget about the diplomatic struggles he'd just endured. He needed a break, a moment to clear his mind. The park outside the diplomatic complex offered a quiet refuge, so Alexander decided to take a stroll. The cool evening breeze rustled through the trees, and the faint sound of the city's heartbeat echoed in the distance. The park, with its exotic plants and winding paths, provided a stark contrast to the polished, high-tech world just beyond the gates. As he walked, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel, Alexander found himself lost in thought. The park's beauty was a welcome distraction from the political chaos of the day. He allowed himself to relax for just a moment, loosening his tie and letting his shoulders drop. The world around him seemed peaceful, far removed from the stressful world of alien politics. Then, just as he was about to take a deep breath and forget his worries for a while, he heard it, the sound of laughter. His son, Noah, was laughing. Curious, Alexander slowed his steps and followed the sound. The laughter led him to a small, secluded bench beneath a canopy of silver-leafed trees. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Noah, sitting on the bench with his head buried in a textbook. But what really caught his attention was the person sitting beside him. A girl, an alien girl, was sitting there, her delicate features illuminated by the soft light of the setting sun. Her skin was a soft lavender, almost translucent in the fading light. It shimmered as she moved, patterns of light dancing across her skin. Her hair was long, silver white, and cascaded down her back in silky waves, contrasting sharply with her worn orange jumpsuit. It was a color that marked her as someone from the lower sectors of the city, the areas where the wealthier citizens rarely ventured. The girl was explaining something to Noah, her voice calm and firm. "You've got the equation backward," she said, pointing at Noah's textbook. "The gravitational constant comes first, then you multiply by the mass values." Her tone was soft, but there was a clear confidence in her voice, something Alexander hadn't expected to hear from someone who appeared to be so young and underprivileged. Noah's face was furrowed in concentration as he scratched out his work and started again. The alien girl, despite her worn-out clothing, seemed to have a deep understanding of complex scientific principles. She wasn't just helping Noah with his homework, she was teaching him, guiding him through the concepts with a level of expertise that far surpassed anything Alexander had seen in the Academy's textbooks. As Alexander watched from behind a group of luminescent bushes, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The girl's intelligence was undeniable. She was teaching Noah quantum physics, a subject that even many adults struggled to understand. Yet, here she was, explaining the complex principles with ease, as if she had been doing this her entire life. Noah, to his credit, was listening intently, eager to learn. His previous reluctance to engage with his homework seemed to have vanished. He was caught up in the excitement of the lesson. Alexander's pride in his son grew as he watched the two of them, Noah, the son of Earth's top diplomat, and Ella, the homeless alien girl from the city's poorest district, sitting together, learning from each other. For a moment, Alexander thought about stepping forward to introduce himself, but something held him back. The scene before him was unusual, almost too perfect. The girl, Ella, was so different from the other children Alexander had seen. She wasn't just any alien. She was something more, intelligent, strong, and resilient. But there was a tension in the air that Alexander couldn't quite place. He could see it in Ella's posture. She was clearly on edge, constantly glancing over her shoulder, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Her guard was up, and Alexander could understand why. The world she came from was nothing like his own. It was a world of hardship and struggle. A world where every day was a fight for survival. Noah, oblivious to the tension, continued to ask questions, clearly fascinated by the lesson. But when Alexander finally stepped into view, both children startled. Ella's eyes narrowed, and her body tensed defensively. She was no longer the teacher, but a child afraid of being caught in a world where she didn't belong. "Dad, I can explain," Noah stammered, his eyes wide with guilt as he clutched his textbook tightly. Alexander raised his hands in a calming gesture. "It's okay, Noah. I'm not angry." He turned his gaze to Ella, who was still watching him carefully, her large eyes filled with wariness. She was sizing him up, just as anyone from her world would, assessing whether he was a threat or a potential ally. "I'm Alexander Carter," he said gently, offering a warm smile. "And you are?" The girl hesitated before answering cautiously. Ella Nerl." "I'm impressed," Alexander replied honestly, nodding toward Noah's book. "You're helping him with quantum physics? That's quite something." Ella's expression softened ever so slightly, but she didn't say anything. Instead, Noah jumped in, eager to explain. "Ella's been helping me with all my homework, Dad. She knows way more about this stuff than anyone at my academy." Alexander smiled at his son's enthusiasm, but also saw the discomfort in Ella's eyes. There was a story here, one that was clearly more complicated than he could understand at a glance. "Where did you two meet?" he asked, genuinely curious. Ella shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Noah and Alexander. She hesitated, as though unsure how much to reveal. Finally, Noah spoke up. "I got lost in the city," he admitted, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "I was supposed to be at a friend's house, but I took the wrong transit line and ended up in Sector 12. Ella found me and helped me get back home." Sector 12, the underbelly of Orbital City, a place where poverty and crime ruled, and where few dared to go. The thought of his son wandering there made Alexander's heart race with concern. "Sector 12, Alexander echoed, his voice soft but filled with a sense of unease. "It's not as dangerous as people think," Ella replied quickly, her voice steady despite the tension. "You just need to know where to go." Noah nodded eagerly, eager to defend his friend. "Ella's the smartest person I know. She taught me a lot about how things work there. It's not all bad." Alexander looked at Ella with new understanding. She was more than just a girl in a worn jumpsuit. She was someone with knowledge, someone who had learned how to survive in a harsh world. And Noah, despite his privileged life, had seen something in her, something beyond her appearance. "Well," Alexander said, breaking the silence, "it's getting late. We should head home, Noah." His gaze turned back to Ella. "Thank you for helping my son. You're welcome to join us for dinner, if you'd like." Ella's eyes widened slightly, surprise flashing across her face. Really, Alexander said, offering her a genuine smile. "Any friend of Noah's is welcome in our home." As they gathered their belongings, Alexander noticed the careful way Ella handled her tattered backpack. There was something precious inside that bag, something she valued more than anything else in the world. It struck him then how little he understood about her life, about the struggle she faced every day. And yet, here she was, teaching his son about the universe, about science, about things no one had ever taught him before. As they walked back to the penthouse, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more important. He didn't know what it was yet, but he could feel the weight of it. And when the elevator doors opened to the penthouse, he felt the truth of it settle in. His life, and Noah's, was about to change forever. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the vast, sleek interior of Alexander's penthouse. The polished floors gleamed under the soft light, and the towering glass windows offered a panoramic view of the city. The room was impeccably decorated, modern, with a touch of luxury, but still lived in. The smell of fresh air mingled with the subtle scent of coffee brewing in the corner. It was a place of comfort, safety, and privilege, a stark contrast to the chaotic world Ella had come from. As they stepped inside, Ella hesitated, glancing around at the lavish surroundings with wide eyes. Alexander noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she adjusted her worn backpack. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but her body language betrayed her unease. This was not a world she was accustomed to. "Please, make yourself comfortable," Alexander said with a kind smile, though he could see how out of place Ella felt. "Noah, why don't you show Ella the view while I prepare dinner?" Noah, always eager to make Ella feel welcome, grinned widely and gestured toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Come on, Ella. You've got to see this. The whole city looks like it's floating in the sky from up here." Ella nodded and followed him, though she didn't look at the view immediately. Instead, her eyes kept darting around the room, taking in every detail. The fine furniture, the delicate artwork on the walls, the soft lighting that seemed to cast a serene glow over everything. She could barely process it. She had never seen anything like this before. Noah, oblivious to her discomfort, leaned against the window and looked out over the city with childlike wonder. "This is where my dad works, and sometimes he brings me up here after school. The view's different every time, depending on the weather. I think it looks best at sunrise. Everything's so peaceful, you know." Ella stood next to him, her gaze finally drifting toward the shimmering lights of the city far below. She had seen many parts of Orbital City, but never from this height. The layers of glass and steel stretched endlessly, their sharp lines broken only by the occasional curve of a bioluminescent tree or the soft glow of distant parks. It was beautiful, but it was also foreign to her. She had never felt so out of place. "I didn't expect all of this," Ella murmured, more to herself than to Noah. Noah's face softened, and he glanced at her. "Yeah, it's a lot, but it's just home for me. We get used to it." He paused for a moment before adding, "You know, I bet if we could bring the Eastern District here, it'd look just as cool. The sky's always clear over there. The stars look amazing." Ella smiled faintly at the thought, her lips curving ever so slightly. Maybe one day. Dinner was a quiet affair, with both Noah and Ella sitting at the large dining table while Alexander made his way to the kitchen. The food prepared by the automated systems was always impeccable, a blend of Terran and alien cuisines. Tonight, however, Alexander had chosen to make something more personal. He had requested a few local delicacies, hoping to make their guests feel more at home. Ella took small, careful bites of the food, clearly unfamiliar with many of the flavors. She kept her eyes down, her silver hair falling over her face as she ate in silence. Noah, ever the talkative one, chattered excitedly about his day at school, about his friends, and even about the upcoming school trip he was looking forward to. But Ella's responses were short, her eyes often glancing at the walls or the food, as if searching for something that wasn't there. As the meal progressed, Alexander watched Ella with growing interest. There was a quiet resilience in her, a calmness that spoke of hardship and survival. She was reserved, but there was also an unmistakable fire in her, an intelligence and a strength that couldn't be ignored. "Ella," Alexander asked, breaking the silence, "how long have you been living in Sector 12? She hesitated, looking down at her plate, but Noah jumped in. "Ella's been living there her whole life, Dad. Her family doesn't have a lot of money. They live in one of the older buildings near the industrial district." Ella nodded, but there was a certain wariness in her eyes. She didn't want to talk about it. "It's not so bad," she replied quietly. "You learn how to get by." Alexander studied her, his mind turning over what he had learned about Ella's life so far. She didn't ask for help, didn't want pity. She was simply surviving, navigating a system that had failed her and her family, just like so many others from the lower sectors. It was clear to him that Ella had more to offer than anyone could imagine. She wasn't just some homeless girl from a poor district. She was resourceful, intelligent, and capable of so much more than the world seemed willing to offer her. "Well, you've certainly impressed Noah with your knowledge," Alexander said, trying to shift the conversation to lighter ground. "He tells me you've been teaching him things about physics that his teachers at the academy couldn't even explain." Ella's cheeks flushed slightly, and she avoided his gaze. I like learning. It helps keep my mind sharp." Alexander smiled, though he saw the hesitation in her eyes. It was obvious she was hiding something. But what? He wasn't sure yet, but he knew he wanted to find out more. After dinner, Noah eagerly took Ella on a tour of the penthouse. He showed her the entertainment system, the vast library of Earth history books, and even the small personal observatory at the top of the building. As they moved through the rooms, Alexander lingered at the kitchen counter, deep in thought. There was something about Ella that intrigued him, something far beyond the fact that she had helped Noah with his homework. Her quiet intelligence, her dignity despite her circumstances, and the guarded way she spoke. It all pointed to something bigger, something Alexander couldn't yet fully understand. He excused himself to make a quick call to his security chief, trying to act as casual as possible, though his mind was racing. "Run a check on Ella Nerl," he said quietly. "I need to know everything about her background. Family, history, everything." As the call ended, Alexander glanced toward the hallway, where Noah and Ella were now talking animatedly. The sound of their laughter filled the space, and for a moment, Alexander felt a warmth he hadn't realized he'd been missing. It was the kind of warmth that came from watching someone overcome odds, seeing the potential for greatness even in the most unlikely places. It struck him then, in that quiet moment of realization, that this was more than just a dinner. This was a turning point. There was more at play here than mere chance. Something about Ella, her presence in their lives, was going to change everything. And Alexander couldn't help but wonder, how far would this journey take them? The next few days passed in a blur of routine. Alexander attended more diplomatic meetings, Noah went back to his school, and Ella continued to visit the penthouse, helping Noah with his studies. There was an unspoken understanding between the three of them now, something beyond the surface politeness that marked the beginning of their interactions. Noah and Ella's bond had grown stronger, not through forced politeness, but through genuine connection. Noah, who had always been an aloof child, now looked forward to his lessons with Ella more than he did his regular classes. They had begun to spend hours together in the study nook by the large windows, Ella explaining complex scientific principles, and Noah absorbing them like a sponge. At first, it had been just physics. Now, it was philosophy, mathematics, and even ancient Earth history. Ella was a natural teacher, and Noah, eager to learn, couldn't get enough of her lessons. One evening, after a long day of work, Alexander returned home to find Noah and Ella sitting at the dining table, deep in conversation. Ella's silver hair shone in the soft light, her eyes glowing with excitement as she explained the concept of multidimensional space-time. Noah sat across from her, scribbling notes furiously. "How much of this do you understand?" Alexander asked, leaning against the doorframe. He couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was rare to see Noah this engaged, especially in subjects that didn't involve sports or adventure stories. Noah glanced up and grinned. "I'm getting it, Dad. Ella's the best teacher ever." Ella looked embarrassed at the compliment, but didn't deny it. "I'm just helping him connect the dots. He's a fast learner." Alexander stepped into the room, his expression turning more serious. "You know, Ella," he began, "Noah isn't the only one who's been learning a lot around here." Ella paused, her eyes flickering with unease. She had grown used to Alexander's quiet presence in the house, but there was something about his tone now that made her wary. She put down her pen, her hands folding together in front of her. "Why do you really help him?" Alexander asked, his voice calm but probing. "You don't owe him anything. You don't owe us anything." The question caught Ella off guard. She had never spoken much about herself, always deflecting attention away from her past and her struggles. She had learned early on that sharing too much of her story made people uncomfortable. It made them look at her differently. "I help because I can," Ella replied quietly, avoiding his gaze. "Because it's good for me. I don't want anything from him, from either of you." Alexander studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes noticing the flicker of something deeper in her eyes, something she wasn't saying. He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "You don't have to explain yourself, but I want you to know something. Noah and we're here for you. No one gets through this world alone, Ella." For a moment, the room was silent. Ella's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I'm not like you. You have a home, a family, a future. I don't." Alexander's heart clenched as the weight of her words hit him. He had known that Ella's life was far from easy, but hearing her speak those words, spoken with such quiet resignation, made him realize just how little he knew about her world. "I don't know what it's like to struggle like you do," he said gently. "But I do know that everyone deserves a chance. And I think you've earned yours." Ella shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I've had my chances. But I wasn't born into a world where chances are given freely. I've learned that people like me, We have to fight for every little bit we get." Her voice was a mix of bitterness and exhaustion, and Alexander could see the years of hardship etched into her expression. She was only a teenager, yet there was an oldness to her, an unwillingness to trust that made her seem much older than her age. "Where do you come from, Ella?" Alexander asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like a weight. "Tell me about your family." Ella stiffened, her shoulders tensing as though bracing herself for an attack. For a brief moment, she looked like she was going to run, but she didn't. She stayed, her eyes meeting his, though there was still a guardedness in her gaze. "I was born in the lower sectors of Orbital City," she began, her voice cold and distant, as though telling a story about someone else. "My parents, they were laborers. They worked long hours just to make sure we had food. And my mother, she got sick a few years ago. Cascade syndrome." At the mention of the illness, Alexander's expression softened. Cascade syndrome was a degenerative disease that affected many in the lower sectors. It was caused by prolonged exposure to toxins in the air and had no known cure. Those afflicted often deteriorated slowly, becoming unable to move, speak, or care for themselves. Ella continued, her voice quieter now. "We lost everything when she got sick. My father couldn't afford the treatment, so he left. I stayed with my mom and my younger brother and sister. We lived in the old apartment until the city decided they needed the land for something else. Now we're just trying to survive." Alexander's heart broke as she spoke. He had known that life in the lower sectors was difficult, but hearing it from Ella, hearing the rawness in her voice, made it real in a way that no statistics or reports ever could. He didn't know what to say. Words felt hollow in the face of her pain. He reached out and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Ella," he said softly, "I'm sorry. I didn't know." She looked up at him, her face set in determination. "No one knows," she said firmly, "and no one really cares. But I'll survive. I always have." As she said those words, Alexander felt a deep sense of respect for her. Ella had faced hardship most people could never imagine, and yet here she was, still standing, still fighting. There was something in her, something unbreakable, that reminded him of the resilience of humanity, the very trait that had helped Earth survive countless challenges over the centuries. Noah looked back and forth between them, sensing the change in the atmosphere. He remained quiet, not wanting to intrude on this moment. "You know," Noah finally said, breaking the silence, "Ella might be a genius, but she's also the bravest person I know." Ella smiled faintly at his words, but her gaze remained fixed on Alexander. "I'm not brave," she said softly. "I just keep going." The days that followed felt like a shift had occurred, but Alexander couldn't quite pinpoint why. He had always thought of himself as a man in control of his surroundings, both the political intricacies of his role and the quiet, structured life he'd carved out for Noah. But ever since Ella had come into their lives, things had started to feel different. Noah had become inseparable from her. She had become not just a tutor, but a confidant, a friend, and, in many ways, a force of change in their household. She had brought something with her that Alexander hadn't realized was missing, an unspoken understanding of the fragility and beauty of life. Watching her interact with Noah, teaching him not just about science and history, but about resilience and compassion, was like watching the sun rise over the horizon for the first time. He could feel the light, the warmth, but he wasn't yet sure what it all meant. It was early evening when the news broke, an urgent message that cut through the calm of the penthouse like a lightning strike. Alexander had just finished a late meeting and was about to settle into his favorite chair when his comm unit buzzed. His security chief's voice was sharp with worry as soon as the call connected. "Sir, there's been a development," his chief said, his voice low. "We've got reports of a major incident in the eastern sector." "Which district?" Alexander asked immediately, his pulse quickening. "Sector 12, the chief replied grimly. At the mention of Sector 12, Alexander's stomach twisted. He knew the dangers of that area, the crime, the poverty, the chaos that seemed to grow like weeds in the shadows. But there was more. He had come to know Ella's story, her struggles, and her quiet strength. The Eastern District was her home. And now, it seemed like something had gone horribly wrong. Alexander's mind raced as he asked his chief for the details. But the response was vague, just a string of fragmented reports about a group of protesters, clashes with security forces, and widespread panic. It was hard to tell if the situation had escalated or if it had always been a powder keg waiting to blow. Either way, it didn't matter. The fact was, the situation was now dangerously close to hitting the tipping point. He disconnected the call and stood, pacing across the sleek, polished floors of the penthouse. His thoughts went immediately to Ella. Was she okay? What was her family going through right now? He felt a cold knot of anxiety settle in his chest. It wasn't long before Ella arrived for her usual evening session with Noah. She had become a fixture in their lives, and the penthouse now seemed a little emptier on the rare nights she didn't show up. But tonight was different. There was a tension in the air, something Alexander could feel even before Ella stepped through the door. She looked the same, her worn jumpsuit, her silver hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, but there was something in her eyes tonight that told him everything had changed. She walked in, and for the first time, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't laughing or joking with Noah. There was a heaviness in her presence, a weariness that spoke volumes. Ella, what's going on? Alexander asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Ella paused at the door, her face tight with concern. I don't know how to explain it, she said, her voice wavering slightly. There are riots breaking out in Sector 12. Protesters, angry mobs, and now security forces clashing with them. People are being hurt, and her voice trailed off. Noah, who had been sitting at the table with his homework, stood up quickly, looking at Ella with a mix of confusion and concern. What's happening over there, Ella? Is it because of, the housing issues? Ella nodded, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists at her sides. It's bigger than that. It's always been bigger than that. But now people are fed up. They don't want to just survive anymore. They want change. Alexander could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain he had seen reflected in her every word and action since their first meeting. She wasn't just talking about a protest. She was talking about a whole system breaking down, a society that had failed people like her and her family. Without thinking, Alexander stepped forward, his tone firm. Ella, you need to stay here tonight. It's too dangerous for you to go back there. She looked at him, but there was no fear in her eyes, only quiet resignation. I can't stay here. My family needs me. Alexander's heart sank. He knew what Ella was thinking. She wasn't just talking about her mother and siblings. She was talking about the people who depended on her. Ella had always been the protector, the one who kept everything together in the chaos of the Eastern District. But tonight, it seemed like the chaos was coming to a head, and she was caught right in the middle of it. No, he said firmly, his voice brokering no argument. You're not going back there tonight. We'll figure something out. Ella shook her head, her expression hardening. I don't have time to wait for something to figure out, Alexander. My family is in danger. People are in danger. If I don't go, who will? She turned and started toward the door, but Alexander stepped in her path, blocking her way. You don't have to do this alone, he said, his voice softening. I know what it's like to fight for something bigger than yourself. But you don't have to keep carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Ella stopped, her back to him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Noah stood silently nearby, his eyes moving between his father and Ella. Finally, Ella spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't understand. You can't. She turned to face him, her face filled with a mix of sorrow and frustration. You have no idea what it's like to grow up in a place like that. To have nothing. To watch the world crumble around you and not be able to do anything about it. Alexander took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. I may not understand completely, Ella, but I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to help. And right now, you need to stay here. We'll work something out. I promise. For the first time in a long while, Ella's eyes softened, and she let out a shaky breath. The walls she had built around herself, the walls she used to keep people at a distance, were beginning to crack. And for a brief moment, Alexander saw something new, vulnerability, raw and unguarded. I don't know how to ask for help, Ella admitted softly, her voice faltering. You don't have to, Alexander replied. You've already done enough. For the first time since she had walked through the door, Ella nodded, though the weight of the world still hung heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but for tonight, she had a place to stay, somewhere safe. As the evening wore on, the three of them sat together, the world outside continuing to burn with unrest, but inside the penthouse, there was a fragile peace. A peace that, for now, was enough. The following days felt like a pressure cooker slowly reaching its boiling point. The situation in Sector 12 worsened by the hour. The protests had turned into riots, and tensions between the impoverished inhabitants of the lower sectors and the city's elite were at an all-time high. Ella had been right. It wasn't just about housing or unfair treatment anymore. It was about the deep, unhealed rift between the classes, the desperation of people who had been ignored for far too long. Alexander tried to stay focused on his diplomatic duties, but his mind kept drifting back to Ella. He knew how much she wanted to return to Sector 12, to help her family, to be there for the people who needed her. And yet, with every passing hour, the situation seemed to grow more dangerous. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do something more. One evening, as the city lights flickered to life outside the penthouse, Alexander made a decision. He was no longer willing to stand by and watch things spiral out of control. The longer the crisis in the lower sectors dragged on, the more likely it was that things would reach a breaking point. The fact that the elite politicians in the council were still treating the situation as a minor inconvenience only infuriated him more. The people of Sector 12, Ella included, were seen as disposable, mere statistics in a system that catered to the privileged. Alexander sat at his desk late that night, the soft hum of the city in the background as he combed through reports from his security chief. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He had been receiving constant updates on the state of the riots in the lower sectors, but there was something else on his mind tonight, the cold, dispassionate language of the reports. Everything seemed so clinical, so detached. It was as if the lives of those suffering in Sector 12 were just numbers on a page. His eyes fell on the one thing that hadn't been formalized yet, his plan. It had been swirling in his mind for days, but he hadn't yet acted. It was time to make the political move, to show the world that someone cared about the forgotten people of the lower sectors. He reached for his comm unit and dialed a familiar contact, Sophia Nathow, Ella's mother. It was a risk. The risks were always higher when one dared to stand up against the powers that be, but this was something he couldn't ignore any longer. He needed help. He needed someone who knew how the system worked from the inside. As the comm unit rang, Alexander's thoughts turned to Ella. He had promised to protect her, but he knew she was going to need more than just protection. She was a fire, a spark that couldn't be extinguished by any single person. The more he got to know her, the more he realized that she wasn't someone who would wait for permission. She was going to fight for change, whether the world was ready for it or not. Sophia's voice broke through his thoughts, calm and firm. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone measured. "What can I do for you?" "Ms. Nathow," he replied, his voice steady despite the anxiety twisting in his chest. "I need your help. We can't keep treating this situation like a passing storm. It's more than that. It's a full-blown crisis, and if something isn't done soon, it's going to get worse." Sophia's silence was heavy, as though she was weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice cool and pragmatic. "I agree. The situation has been escalating for days, but the council hasn't acknowledged the severity of it. They think it's just a small revolt that will burn itself out." "That's the problem," Alexander said, frustration creeping into his tone. "The council doesn't see the bigger picture. These people aren't just protesting for food or shelter, they're fighting for their dignity. They're fighting for their right to exist as more than just pawns in a system that doesn't care about them." Sophia's voice softened, a slight tremor in her words. "I know that better than anyone. But there are powerful forces at play here, Mr. Carter. You know that." "I do," Alexander admitted. "Which is why I need you. Your position gives you access to circles I can't reach, and you know how to navigate this world better than anyone. I need you to help me bring attention to this. If we can create a coalition, get the media involved, maybe we can force the council to do something before it's too late." There was a long pause, and then Sophia responded with a quiet, determined resolve. "I'll do what I can. But we'll need to be careful. If we push too hard, too fast, it could backfire. The council will see it as an attack. We need to be strategic." Alexander nodded, his mind already working through the logistics of her words. "We'll start small, talk to the media, get people talking about what's happening on the ground. The more pressure we put on them, the harder it will be for them to ignore us." "Agreed," Sophia said, her voice firm. "I'll make some calls. We'll get started immediately." As the call ended, Alexander leaned back in his chair, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. This wasn't just about political maneuvering. It was about changing lives, about showing that the people of Sector 12 were more than just a footnote in a world of diplomacy and privilege. At that moment, Noah appeared in the doorway, his face tight with concern. "Dad, is everything okay?" Alexander looked up at his son, his heart swelling with love and pride. "Everything will be fine, Noah," he said, his voice reassuring. "We're going to make sure of it." Noah hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door, where Ella had just entered. There was something different in her posture tonight, something stronger, more determined. "I don't think Ella's coming back," Noah said softly, his gaze lingering on her. Alexander turned toward Ella, his heart sinking at the look in her eyes. She had always been strong, but tonight, there was an intensity in her expression that he hadn't seen before. She was ready for something, ready to make a stand. "I'm not going back to Sector 12 tonight," Ella said quietly, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "The protests are turning into something worse. I can't just sit back and wait anymore. I'm going to help them, whatever it takes." Alexander stepped forward, his instincts kicking in. "Ella, you don't have to do this. There's another way. We're going to." Ella cut him off, her voice sharp with conviction. "I can't just stand by and watch, Mr. Carter. I have to do something." For a moment, Alexander stood frozen, the weight of her words hitting him harder than he'd expected. Ella wasn't just another girl from the lower sectors. She was a leader, someone who understood the stakes far more than he did. No, this wasn't her burden alone. This was their fight now. "Then let's fight together," Alexander said quietly, determination creeping into his voice. Ella met his gaze, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, trust. And in that moment, Alexander knew that this was just the beginning. The morning after their conversation was a whirlwind. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the city as Alexander and Ella, with Noah by their side, gathered their resources and prepared for a day that could change everything. Ella was determined to head back to Sector 12, but Alexander wasn't going to let her go alone, not after everything that had happened. He wasn't sure what he could do, but he wasn't about to stand on the sidelines while Ella put herself at risk. Noah, ever the optimist, was quietly getting ready, but the tension in the air was thick. He didn't fully understand the complexities of what was going on in the lower sectors, but he understood one thing. Ella was important to him, and she was going back to where the fighting had started. He couldn't let her go without trying to help. "We have to move quickly," Alexander said, his voice firm as he gathered his coat from the back of the chair. "The media is already starting to pick up on the situation in Sector 12, but it's not enough. The council's still ignoring it." Ella, already standing by the door, nodded without speaking. She had packed only the bare essentials, a few clothes, a small data pad, and a slim medkit that could mean the difference between life and death in the chaos of the lower sectors. Her focus was razor-sharp. The hesitation that had marked her the night before was gone. Now, all that remained was determination. Alexander turned to Noah, who was looking at the two of them with a quiet resolve. "Noah, I need you to stay here. It's not safe out there." Noah, though he understood his father's concerns, didn't back down. "I'm not just staying here while you both go. I can help. I have to help." Ella placed a hand on his shoulder. "Noah, this is dangerous. It's going to get worse before it gets better. You don't need to be a part of this." But Noah wasn't backing down. His gaze hardened with the same intensity that had been growing within him for days. "You don't understand. You've always been there for me, Ella. And now I need to be there for you. You're not alone in this." A silence fell between them, and for a moment, Ella looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Noah wasn't just the son of a diplomat anymore. He was a friend, a partner in this. Someone who understood her pain and was willing to fight alongside her, no matter the cost. Alexander, sensing the weight of the moment, sighed and gave a reluctant nod. "All right, but you need to stay close. This is not a game. People are fighting for their lives out there. We need to stick together." With that, they left the penthouse. The sleek elevator carried them down to the street level, and as the door slid open, the weight of what was about to happen settled over them all. The streets of Orbital City had never looked so cold. What had once been a gleaming, prosperous city now felt like a powder keg, waiting for the spark. As they walked toward the transport station, the air was thick with tension. A low hum of voices echoed in the distance, and the occasional cry of protest could be heard, reverberating through the streets. The atmosphere was electrified, filled with the kind of energy that could either ignite change or lead to complete destruction. Alexander kept a close eye on the security cameras that scanned the area as they made their way to the transport hub. He had already contacted his allies, some of whom had quietly rallied their support, but nothing felt secure. The entire city felt on edge, as though it were teetering on the edge of collapse. As the transport pod arrived, Alexander, Noah, and Ella boarded swiftly. The sleek vehicle glided smoothly through the city's veins, carrying them toward the heart of the Eastern District, where the unrest was at its worst. Outside the windows, the cityscape blurred, replaced by the looming, crumbling structures of the lower sectors. The contrast was stark, glistening towers of wealth on one side, decaying buildings that had been abandoned by both the system and its people on the other. Ella remained silent throughout the ride, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The closer they got to Sector 12, the more tense she became. This was her home, but it was also the place where so much pain and suffering had shaped her into the person she was today. The place she had fought to survive, and the place she was now about to confront head-on. Finally, the transport slowed as it approached the main intersection leading into Sector 12. The scene before them was one Alexander had seen in countless reports. Protesters shouting, waving signs, their faces filled with a mix of rage, desperation, and hope. The distant hum of sirens and the sound of clashing voices echoed off the concrete walls, blending into a cacophony of chaos. As they disembarked, Alexander's heart tightened. This wasn't just a protest, it was an all-out fight for survival. And in the center of it all stood Ella, the one person who could see through the smoke and mirrors, the one person who could bridge the chasm between the elites and the oppressed. "Stay close," Alexander instructed, his voice tight with concern. Ella nodded, her jaw clenched with a newfound resolve. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. She had been here before, in the heart of the struggle, but this was different. This time, she wasn't just a bystander. She was a part of something bigger than herself. Noah stayed right behind her, looking around nervously but determined to stick by her side. They walked toward the protesters, the tension in the air thickening with every step. Ella's presence seemed to cut through the noise of the crowd. People noticed her, and for a brief moment, the chaotic scene seemed to pause as they recognized her. "Ella Nerrill," a voice called out from the crowd. It was a familiar face, one of the community leaders she had known for years. "You're back." "I'm back," Ella said, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "And I'm here to help." Before anyone could respond, a loud bang echoed through the streets. A security drone, hovering overhead, released a warning shot, sending the crowd scattering in every direction. The fight was no longer just a peaceful protest. It had officially escalated into an open conflict. In the chaos, Ella grabbed Noah's arm and pulled him into an alley, away from the line of fire. Alexander followed closely behind, his mind racing as he processed what was happening. "Stay low," he ordered, pulling his son close to him. "We need to get to safety before things get worse." But Ella wasn't looking for safety. She wasn't running. She was looking for the heart of the storm. She was looking for the leader who could turn the tide, and she was willing to face it head-on. "No," Ella said, her voice fierce as she turned to Alexander. "I'm going in. This ends today." The sounds of chaos filled the air as Ella, Alexander, and Noah made their way deeper into the heart of Sector 12. The streets, once teeming with people going about their daily lives, were now a battlefield. Broken glass littered the pavement, and plumes of smoke rose into the sky as distant explosions rocked the district. Protesters clashed with heavily armored security forces, their shouts mixing with the harsh screech of metal on metal. Ella led the way, her pace quick and purposeful. She had no intention of running from the storm. She was walking straight into it. She could feel the fire building inside her, the resolve that had always been with her, but now burned brighter than ever. Alexander stayed close, his eyes darting around, constantly alert. He had seen unrest before, but nothing like this. This wasn't just about a fight for resources. This was a fight for dignity, for respect, for the right to exist without fear of being crushed underfoot by a system that saw the people of Sector 12 as nothing more than expendable pawns. Noah stayed close to Ella, his young face drawn with concern but also determination. His earlier fear had been replaced by a quiet resolve. He had never seen this side of Ella before, the warrior within her that had always fought to survive, but now, to lead. They reached the makeshift barricade where the heart of the protest seemed to be centered. Ella's old friends, some from her childhood and others from the community she had helped support, were gathered here, rallying the people to stand their ground. They turned when Ella approached, their eyes filled with surprise and respect. "Ella," one of them called out, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're back. We didn't think you would come." Ella's gaze hardened as she stepped forward, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I didn't just come to watch," she said, her tone fierce, her words cutting through the noise. "I came to help. And this ends now." The crowd murmured, uncertainty hanging in the air, but Ella stood tall, her presence commanding attention. She wasn't just a girl from the slums anymore. She was a symbol, a living testament to the strength of the people who had been ignored for too long. "We're not just fighting for food or shelter," Ella continued, her voice rising. "We're fighting for our dignity, for our rights to live without fear. The system has failed us, but we don't need their approval to fight for what's ours. We've fought for survival all our lives. Now we're fighting for change." A roar went up from the crowd, a surge of energy that filled the air. Ella's words were a spark, and in that moment, the flames of revolution ignited. The people of Sector 12 weren't just fighting because they were hungry or cold. They were fighting because they were tired of being overlooked, tired of being treated as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. As Ella spoke, Alexander watched from behind, his heart swelling with pride and something else, fear. He knew this wasn't just a speech. This was the moment of no return. The energy of the crowd had shifted. They were no longer just protesters. They were a force, and Ella had become their leader. A loud siren wailed overhead, and a group of security drones descended, their mechanical eyes scanning the crowd. The atmosphere shifted again, this time with the cold tension of impending violence. "They're coming," Alexander muttered, his hand instinctively moving toward the comm unit on his wrist. But Ella raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "No," she said, her voice filled with quiet defiance. "This time, we stand our ground." The drones hovered above them, their metal bodies gleaming in the dim light. A voice crackled through the air, harsh and metallic. "All civilians, disperse immediately. You are in violation of the curfew. Failure to comply will result in forceful action." Ella's eyes narrowed, and she stepped forward, her voice calm but laced with authority. "We've been in violation of this system for years," she said, her words directed not at the drones, but at the people. "We've been silent long enough. Now we speak. Now we stand together." The crowd erupted into chants, their voices rising in a wave of unity. "No more, no more, no more." Alexander's eyes searched the crowd, the tension palpable. The security forces were preparing to strike, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of something powerful in the air. The people of Sector 12 were no longer just protesting. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves, for each other. As the drones advanced, Ella's hand shot up, signaling the crowd to stop. She wasn't afraid, and it was contagious. The people stood their ground, the fear that had once controlled them evaporating as they drew strength from Ella's unwavering resolve. Then, as if on cue, a loud boom echoed through the air. A sudden explosion rocked the streets, throwing the crowd into chaos. The ground trembled beneath them as another explosion followed, this time closer. The sound of sirens grew louder as security forces surged forward, and the clash between the people of Sector 12 and the city's elite escalated into full-blown conflict. Ella didn't flinch. She grabbed Noah's arm and pulled him to her side, her eyes locked on the front lines where the clash was most intense. "We can't stop now," she said, her voice steady and fierce. "This is our chance." Without another word, she led the charge. The people followed her, their voices rising in unison as they surged forward, ready to fight for what they had been denied for so long. Alexander hesitated for only a moment before following, his mind racing with the enormity of the situation. But when he looked at Ella, he knew. This was the moment. The world was changing. They reached the barricades at the front lines, where the protests had now turned into an all-out struggle. Ella, with Noah at her side, pushed through, taking charge of the situation. She coordinated with the leaders in the crowd, directing them to safer positions and pushing back against the security forces that were trying to suppress them. At that moment, Alexander knew something profound was happening. It wasn't just about Sector 12 anymore. It was about the future of Orbital City, about the future of all the sectors. And it all began with a young girl, born into the harshest conditions, who refused to accept that her voice didn't matter. Ella Nerl was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, and the spark she had ignited in the hearts of the people would never be extinguished.